This is Y376 International Political Economy, October 16, 2008. This chart shows which countries are the major consumers of petroleum between 1960 and 2005. You can see the number. United States is the largest consumer. It's grown from about 9 million barrels per day in 1960 to about 20 million barrels per day in 2005. The former Soviet Union was the second largest consumer, but after the Soviet Union broke up, consumption in Russia was considerably lower, partly because of the difficulties of adjusting to the post-communist economy. But you can also see that China and India have been growing consumers of oil in recent years. The U.S. Production of oil peaked in the late 1960s and has been pretty much on a downward trajectory. The consumption, however, has been rising fairly steadily, except for drops after 1973 and 1978, the oil price increases. You can see that oil consumption was rising a little bit more rapidly before 1973 than after 1980. But nevertheless, consumption has been growing, and the gap between consumption and production means that the U.S. has to make up the difference in imports. So the percentage of our petroleum needs that have to be satisfied imports has been growing fairly steadily. The same thing's happening in China and India. Production in China has been going up a little faster than production in India, but because both economies are growing in the 8 to 10% per year range, the gap between production and consumption is growing, so that both of these countries are contributing to global demand for oil exports. The major reserves are primarily in the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, but you'll notice that Canada has a fairly large amount of petroleum reserves. Russia and the United States are considerably less than the Middle East countries. And generally speaking, the countries that dominate oil exports are the members of OPEC. So this table lists the members of OPEC. There are 13 countries currently in the organization. Apparently, Indonesia is about to leave next year. One of these countries, Ecuador, quit between 1992 and but came back in 2007. The five founding members of OPEC are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. This is a picture of OPEC headquarters in Vienna, picture of the OPEC conference in December 2007 in Abu Dhabi, showing the oil ministers of all the member countries. There's a picture of Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, who was one of the leading leaders of OPEC in the 1970s and 1980s from Saudi Arabia. This shows OPEC production between 1970 and 2007 in millions of barrels per day. You can see there's a major decline in production after 1980, part of an effort to keep prices high, but also a response to conservation measures in the industrialized world. Saudi Arabia contributes by far the largest amount of production, peaking at around 9.5, 10 million barrels per day during maximal periods. But Saudis cut their production to less than 5 million barrels per day in the mid-80s. Most other countries have experienced fairly stable rates of production, with some exceptions, such as Iran and Iraq during the 1980-1988 war, the invasion of Kuwait, 1991, and then Iraq suffered a decline, after the U.S. invasion in 2003. One of the concerns of OPEC is that it continued to be a fairly high percentage of total oil production. You can see that there was some decline in its percentage of oil production in the 1980s, but it's returned to be roughly 40% of world oil production in recent years. Excuse me. This chart shows some of where the deposits are, the major deposits, mainly in the Middle East, for example. But you can also see a fairly big amount in Indonesia. In any case, this also shows the various choke points for ocean shipping of petroleum by ocean tankers. You can see that the major flows are from the Persian Gulf to Europe and the United States, and also to Japan. The Persian Gulf stuff has to go either through the Suez Canal or around the tip of the Horn of Africa. The green lines represent the flows from Mexico and Venezuela to foreign markets, and you can also see some flows from Alaska. The purple is flows from Russia into Western Europe. This chart shows the price of oil between 1861 and 2006. If you control for inflation, which is the red line, you get the sense that oil prices were in a long-term decline from the 1870s on until the oil price increases of the 1970s. They again declined through the 1980s until the more recent price increases of the last 3-4 years. The price of oil is definitely subject to disruptions in world oil supply connected with international conflicts. So you have the Yom Kippur War preceded the OPEC embargo of 1973 and the price increases of that period. You have the Iranian Revolution in 1978 preceded the price increases of that period. The war in the Gulf in 1991, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. These are all things that contributed to some increases in prices. This chart just lists a bunch of connections between politics and political events and oil market situations. So I'm not going to really go over this one. And one of the important things that happened after the 1970s was fairly intense efforts to conserve petroleum and fossil fuels. There were higher taxes on gasoline and fuel oil in Western Europe. The U.S. adopted fuel efficiency standards for motor vehicles. There was an accelerated adoption of energy-efficient heating for homes, offices, and factories, and a general substitution of energy-conserving technologies for energy-intensive technologies. The result being that in the U.S., for example, the ratio between energy consumption and increases in GDP declined steadily from 1970 to 2004. This chart shows what's been happening in the last 5 years, in oil prices per barrel of oil. You can see that we had a fairly steady decline up through, say, about 2006, and then a steeper decline up until the summer of 2008. We've just experienced a fairly rapid decline in the price. Looks like there was an overshooting of what the market would bear there in that period. So, lucky for us. So what role did energy politics play in September 11? We need to think about this in terms of Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. This picture shows the Caspian Sea in the middle, which is where quite a lot of new deposits of oil and natural gas were discovered in the 1990s. The problem is that this particular set of deposits was discovered, but there was some difficulty in finding ways to get the oil and natural gas from this region to the major consuming areas, which are in Western Europe or the United States or East Asia. So that set off a whole set of maneuvers about what kinds of pipelines would be created to carry the natural gas and oil out of the Caspian Sea region to other regions. An example of this is the routes between Baku and Russia, Georgia, and Turkey. So you have three main potential ways to get that oil out of there through the Baku-Novorossiysk, or the BN pipeline, through the Baku-Tbilisi to Supsa BTS pipeline, or the BTC, Baku-Tbilisi Selyan in Turkey. So the American government would prefer that oil from Baku flew not far through Russia, but rather through Georgia and Turkey. And so the U.S. government encouraged U.S. oil companies to finance those two pipelines. The Russian pipeline is financed primarily by the National Oil Company of Azerbaijan and the Russian National Pipeline Company. The reason why the U.S. prefers the non-Russian routes is because of Russia's increasing efforts to use its oil and natural gas power and its control over pipelines to squeeze the Western Europeans or the countries through which the pipelines are flowing. One alternative route for Caspian oil and natural gas is through Kabul, through Afghanistan, and so that would be going from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan to Pakistan to the Indian Ocean, this would require that the Taliban basically support or not interfere with such a pipeline. So that has played a role in the kinds of politics that have been going on in Afghanistan since 2003. This just shows the route of the pipeline that would go from Tengiz in Kazakhstan, which is the major oil deposit there, oil field there, to through Turkmenistan, through Afghanistan, through Pakistan to Gwadar on the Indian Ocean. So Saudi Arabia is an important player in all this because it's the largest single supplier of oil and also has the largest proven reserves. The small Saudi population permits them the luxury of varying the amount of oil they sell, and they have the potential to be the enforcer of OPEC price and production quota agreements. The Saudis would like the price to increase sometimes when the price is going down, in which case they can unilaterally pump less oil if they want the price to increase. If they want the price to decrease, which they do sometimes to punish countries that overproduce their OPEC quota, they can sell or pump more oil, thereby having an effect on global supply and reducing the price. And they have done that several times historically. It's difficult for the Saudis to do this when their oil revenues are shrinking, and you can see that from the mid-1980s through really the beginning of around 2000, that was the problem for the Saudis. So they've been more aggressive as enforcers of OPEC agreements in the 1970s and early 80s, and in more recent years than they were during the other periods. The United States is in a strange position vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. The United States wants the price of oil to be as low as possible. It sees the Saudis as moderates and powerful within OPEC, and therefore wants to be on the be buddies with Saudi Arabia. However, the Saudi regime, in order to maintain domestic stability, have made peace with the Wahhabi Islamic groups who dominate the religion of Saudi Arabia. And these groups have been quite radical in many ways and funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and also pay for the teaching of fundamentalist Islamic principles through the Quranic schools that can be found in many parts of the Islamic world. Osama bin Laden himself is a Saudi, and many of the members of Al-Qaeda are also from Saudi Arabia. So it's a bit of a problem. The U.S. would like to be on the same side as Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia has also been supportive of, to some degree, not necessarily the government, but Saudi citizens have helped to finance some of the operations of Al-Qaeda and the more radical Islamic groups.